Hello and welcome to this week's review on My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing the episode Let You Down, and we start off these reviews, as we always do with them, by talking about the positives, all the things that I enjoyed about the episode, all the things that I thought were great, and of course we move on to the negatives later on. I think that this episode, as we go into the headline positives, I think this episode had a very strong opening. I love the opening scene with all the stuff with Toga, which I'll discuss in more detail later on. This then all pivoted into some decent plotting and scheming moments, depending on the alignment of our particular characters in question, and it ended with a decent cliffhanger-esque moment. Here we are with the great plan now finally afoot. The big trap has been set and now been sprung for all for one. Maybe, I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit confused by it. Like, I understand the plan, I understand the plot, I understand the scheme that our heroes have, but it's just certain elements of how it's all been executed that's making me kind of question things a little bit. Now, this is something I'll discuss in greater detail later on. The only reason why I'm bringing it up now is because I know that not a lot of people stick for the whole duration of the video, so this is a great time to get some insight. Now, as far as I'm aware, the villains that All For One is summoning are just copies. So this whole big plan that our heroes have of splitting everyone up to take them down one by one, I mean, they could still do that, but at the same time, that's something that it feels like they're going to say for the actual big villains themselves, or are they actually being summoned with some kind of space-timey portal thing? I really don't know. Try to keep your responses as spoiler-free as possible, but I will discuss, like I say, this whole sequence of events in greater detail later on. Despite my greater instincts and my better thoughts, I think we should discuss this episode in a semi-linear fashion, so we might as well talk about the opening section of this episode, the stuff which I will be honest I found to be by far and away the most compelling and the most interesting stuff we've seen in this episode, and possibly some of the most compelling and interesting stuff that we have seen this season thus far. And it's here that we get this great insight into the history and mental state of Toga, aka the creepy stabby one. It's a short but intriguing look, which is one which, let's be honest, is rather creepy and unpleasant, but in the best possible ways, which I know feels like damning with faint praise, but yeah, everything that we get in that opening sequence of events, all this stuff with her is just brilliant to me. Some of the best stuff I've seen this season thus far. We get a look back to her as a child and get a pretty good indication of what life was like of her before she became the person that we all know, and how she coped with everything. We're still very early into the video, but, you know, you've seen the episode, so you know what I'm referring to here. We get a great insight as to how she became the creature that we know her today, how all that was built up over years. Some of it is being stuff, well, pretty much all of it is fairly subtle building. We got a lot more of a, I won't say heavy-handed, but a lot more of a focused deep dive into who she really is deep down, I think last season or the season before it, and this is giving a little bit of an insight into her home life. We hear her father, I think it's her father, it might be someone else, shouting to her off screen. We see the graffiti that's left around the house as to what other people think of her, and we know that that ends up correlating to what we've heard of her about her backstory from previous flashbacks. That girl ain't right, and the solution by those around her, seemingly her father or maybe another adult male in her life, was to just shout at her rather than getting her some serious psychiatric help. Later on in the episode, of course, we get this scene with Uchako and Midori reflecting about what they know about the villains and how they know that they aren't just evil, that there is a tragicer side to them, and that at the end of the day, whilst that is still an element of them that they have to be respectful of, that doesn't excuse the stuff that they've done, it just contextualizes this. And that's getting this insight as to young Toga and just the mess that she was, and how seemingly no one was able to deal with her appropriately apart from just treating her like just a naughty schoolgirl. And how we all know how things boiled out from that point on just adds to this sense of tragedy with her as a character. And much like with Tomura twice, and with many of the villains that we see in this series, we're left with that uncomfortable reality that if only someone had intervened earlier and given them the support that they needed, they likely wouldn't have turned to villainy or been brought into that orbit. Had she got the psychiatric help that she needed, she probably wouldn't have gone down this path. Had she got even just the help into her quirk and understanding it better, she probably wouldn't have gone down the path that she did do. And that adds a greater sense of tragedy and just this rather unpleasant grimness to the character that in another life they're probably living some kind of slightly obsessive but ultimately rather harmless teen girl life or early 20-something girl life, depending on how old the character is, and now she's a horrible murderous vampire because she didn't get the help that she needed. That earlier part of the episode has this dark, sinister, rotting atmosphere to it, this insidious dread that is just draped over all of it, from how everything is designed, for how the fact it's all taking place at night, which simple thing, but it really does add a sense of place and a sense of unease to everything. To all the graffiti that we see scrolled around, saying some really unpleasant, nasty things about the character and who they are and how people end up seeing them. We don't know if all this graffiti is recently there or has been there for years, and that this is just how people have always felt of her because of the fact that she murdered someone when she was younger. I really do wish that this whole episode had been about her, and about getting an understanding, a better understanding as to how she became the person that she is, and how she sees the world and how she sees herself in it, because she's a very broken human being. She has these very odd flights of fancy, and how that is all displayed, how that is depicted in this episode, I think is creepy yet has a haunting beauty to it, which I really just find brilliantly compelling. It feels to me, and I don't want to be too critical off the bat because I know that we're still relatively early into the review, that this feels like this whole backstory material was part of a separate episode in the manga. Maybe a shorter one, maybe not, but it was lumped in with this one, with all the stuff with the plot and the trap and that, to build out the runtime. I don't know if that is the case, and I'd have to read the manga to know that for certain, but I get that feeling because Toga doesn't really factor into things much after that point, apart from the conversation with Uraraka and Midoriya, and that could quite easily have just followed in the following episode of the manga anyway. But still, all that stuff getting the insight into Toga and how it's presented, how it's put together, how it's performed, how it is written, great stuff. Everything thereafter is largely fine for me. I think that when we get to UA and all of that stuff, it's good, it's decent for what it is. We get a brief, very, very brief smattering of action of our heroes walloping escaped prisoners. If there was time for a filler, we probably could have had an entire episode with them tracking down and defeating a villain, which we're not getting, as it feels like we're all full steam ahead now to the grand conclusion. There is this we get to see that there are some followers of All For One who have infiltrated the refugee camp, and they're preparing to launch a plan to attack it from the inside, which is in some way referenced by the fact that the new hero base is called Troy, and it was during the Trojan War that Troy used the Trojan horse, which that's technically what the infiltrators are. Maybe that is a reference, I really don't know, but given that the series creator denied the connections to the Three Musketeers, given the all for one, one for all bit, maybe he just knew a guy called Troy and he wanted to put a reference in there because, hey, that's my buddy, that's someone that I met a few years back, they were great, let's put a little bit of a nod into them. We really don't know, but hey, it's a neat little reference, a neat little literary reference for those who know, and if they don't know, well, now you know. The scene with Tomura and the other villains in the cave, again, is fine. Much like this stuff with the heroes and our main cast, it feels very procedural for the most part. It's the connecting tissue. This is where the characters are, this is how they're dealing with their plans and their schemes and their desires to get their end in the end, and it's good for what it is. We get a little bit more set up for the Heteromorph Rebellion thing, though it does feel, in some regards, with that, like, when do we get to the fireworks factory? Because it feels like, okay, now we're getting into it. No, we're not. Now we get. No, we're not. No, we're not. And you will see where we end up going with all of that. A big thing that I think stuck out for me during all that kind of stuff is that, whilst I do appreciate the greater insight into the Heteromorph Rebellion thing and Spinner's connection to it and how he's become this this figurehead for it inadvertently, which is stuff that I really do hope they drill down into. And again, this, much like this stuff with Tomura, could be in its own episode, and I have a feeling that it might well be in the not too distant future. The big thing that I want to talk about is All For One saying that Tomura is overcoming the Quirk Doomsday theory. Only he isn't, though. Look, anyone that's been watching these reviews for a decent number of time knows that I think the whole Quirk Doomsday theory is a bit dumb. I really don't like it. I don't like it on a in-universe perspective, and I certainly don't like it on a more meta real-world perspective, because it feels, you know, just to boil things down, at least on the real world perspective, it feels like putting a time limit on your universe. It feels like saying, okay, I'm only going to be doing one season of this, and anything after this, the world's going to end, so enjoy it! Or words to that effect. I don't like it. Or it's them setting up for the sequel series where they have to deal with that, and I don't want them to deal with it because I don't like the idea of it. But, and even then, within universe, it feels like, given kind of similar theories and ideals that we've seen in this series, it feels like it's quackery that's been manipulated for dark ends, to manipulate people into doing All For One's bidding. But yeah, that's a whole discussion and a debate for a whole other video. But even if we get rid of the bias, and even if we eliminate the headcanon from the perspective, this isn't what Tomura's doing here. It really is. He's not overcoming jack shit. He just lost a bunch of quirks, and he had the shit beaten out of him. If anything, he's further away from becoming this Quirk Doomsday thing than ever before. Maybe All For One is just saying that for the sake of putting the fear of God in the spinner to say, yeah, don't get any cute ideas of over-planning me with all these heteromorph cult things, because I'm going to beat you into submission if you try to. That might be his thing in doing that, or maybe he's just high on his own supply. He's just at this point thinking that he is this demon god of the world thing, as Tomura, or rather Aaoyama, describes later on. The scene with Midoriya and Ochako discussing the deeper side of some of the villains that they've seen, the deeper humanity buried within them, I think that's a good scene for what it is. I know that some people are criticising it for it being heavy-handed with its messaging, even if they themselves do agree with it, and they don't find the execution itself to be that good. I get that, I understand that, and for my money, I think the messaging itself is perfectly fine. I just think the fact that they're going out of their way to underline it at this point feels itself a little bit much, but it does feel like a case of them underlining it for the sake of the people in the back of the class that's only really here for the sake of the action sequences, the people that aren't really here for the deeper subtextual stuff. So yes, we've got to do this because some people refuse to look at the deeper subtext of these things. The final scene with Aaoyama is great, but look, we knew that this was a setup going into this. We knew that there was going to be this trap used to set up All For One, and that he was going to act as bait within it. So his betrayal, one way or the other, was going to end up playing into our hero's hands. And we end up learning that his betrayal was part of the act, which honestly does take something out of this scene, and I can't say that I like it. Now, I'm not going to go into going into the negative territory just yet, but I feel that him betraying them out of a sense of fear, despite everything, is a lot more powerful than him betraying them as part of the cover story and part of the act itself. Because, quite frankly, that shows a side to our character, the character of Aaoyama, that we haven't really seen, and which shows the just sheer fearful desperation within him. Him being part of the plan, him understanding what he has to do, and him knowing that he's part of the bait for all of this. I don't like it. It adds a complication into things that isn't really needed. But I will say is that whole sequence of events does call into question All For One's quirks, or at least his perception of them. Before all that stuff kicks off, we have this sequence where All For One talks about how he has this quirk that allows him to understand when someone's lying to him, how he knows if there's malice in the heart of the person that's talking to him, so he knows if they're lying or not. And this is all setting up for, essentially, oh, he's going to figure out that this is a trap ahead of time, and he's going to spring a trap on the heroes. He's going to trap the people trying to set a trap. However, that doesn't happen. He himself is misled. And that is itself interesting. I think that it acts as something as a red flag for the character. Maybe he doesn't have the level of control over his quirks that he has. Maybe there's a quirk that he lost, given all the stuff with Star and Stripe earlier in the series. Or maybe he's just too high on his own ego and he thinks he's just so unperishable that he just didn't see the warning signs ahead of him, or he just couldn't detect it. It is interesting. I'm interested to see if this is the hint of something else coming down the line or not, but we'll soon see about that. And yeah, so I'm just going to say this here and now, and I don't know if I should discuss this in the overview or not, but we're discussing it in the here and now. This isn't the start of the big final fight, is it? I'm only asking this because, again, like I said towards the start of this review, I'm confused as to where all this is really coming from, how we're actually getting into this, because, well, if we just look at it from a pure structural point of view, I'm unsure how you then drag this out for the remaining 5 months if this is the final season, and if this is not the final season, then I'm really concerned as to how you then drag that up for a further 6 months next year. Like, in the previous seasons, I felt exhausted after maybe 6 or 7 weeks of what felt like an elongated action sequence. Going into several months at that point feels like it's taking the piss a little bit slightly. Though, I have a feeling that won't be the case. This isn't the big fight. It is something of a tease and a setup for it, that this season, this whole fight sequence will ultimately be an attempt to try and take down All For One. He manages to get away, but it's a bit worse for wear. But then he tries to merge with Tomura prematurely, and that helps set us up for the big final confrontation next season, or later on in this season, depending on how things ultimately end up hanging. But we'll soon see as all that is concerned, because, you know, there is a part of me that, because of how certain other plot points have washed out, I don't know how we're going with all of this. With that said and done, however, let us get into the negatives, and I have to say is that, for me, the episode itself did end up feeling a tad disjointed. The stuff with Toga, as I mentioned previously in this review, I thought was fantastic, and honestly, you could probably build an entire episode around that. We then end up pivoting back to our heroes and all the plans to take down All For One, which, good for what it is, but feels a bit standard and procedural, and it feels like the shift in focus is just so much that, like I said earlier on in the review, it feels like they've taken one bit for one episode of the manga and one bit from another episode of the manga and put them together in a way where it doesn't really feel that consistent with one another. Like, just the sheer creepy, weird, slightly horror-afflicted tone that we get in the first half of the episode, or rather, the first quarter, I suppose, of the episode, is radically different to everything that we get thereafter. It has this darker, somber, gothic feel about it, and then we just go back to our heroes doing the superhero thing, which is good, it's fun for what it is, but yeah, it feels disjointed. Not enough to really condemn the episode over, but it is one of those things where it just leaves me sat here thinking, look at what we could have won, just thinking, okay, we could have done more here, but still, I'm sure that we'll get more of that character in the not too distant future. Well, that said, get into the overview. Then the episode itself was good, starting off really strong, kind of faded out towards the middle of it. I think they kind of bungled the ending a little bit to it. I still think that Tomura should have betrayed them out of a genuine sense of, I'm trying to protect my family, rather than the whole thing of pretending to betray them because that's the plan, because that feels a bit skew with, unless of course they are setting it up that All For One's quirks may be out working to the fullest, or there's some problems there. That would be interesting, that maybe our big bad villain isn't really as big and as bad as he really thinks it is, but we'll soon see where all that goes. So while that's said and done, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner. Time for comments. Still no cheesy jingle because I can't afford it yet. But anyway, time for Comment Corner, and we kick off with Big X1, who says, I thought the episode was fine, but it felt like too much setup for me. Of course, he's referring to the previous episode of My Hero Academia, and I have to say that I don't think I totally agree. I do agree with the sense it did feel like a lot of setup, but there was still some good quality there. Again, with a lot of this stuff, I think that it was, as much as there was setup, there was enough meat there to enjoy. I think there was enough to enjoy. I know I'm repeating myself, but with that in mind, let's move on and go to Scott TV Gamer, who says, pretty great episode overall. Not really much to say this week, though I'll definitely have more to say in regards to the next episode, which of course is this week's episode. If you want to let me know what you think about this week's episode, leave a comment in the comment section down below. And this week's episode, I think, was certainly stronger, certainly as I mentioned previously, in the early parts of it than the latter halves a bit, but I think it's good for what it is. I could quite easily see a universe where this is handled much worse, with some rather awkward filler stuff thrown in, with some really tonally inconsistent gags and joke moments, but still, It does everything that it needs to in a very perfectly commendable and perfectly well done way. Again, let me know what you all thought about it in the comment section down below. A big thank you to all the new subscribers that we've been having, all the people that have been liking and enjoying the videos. It really does me a power of good when I end up seeing that stuff, and you by all means continue to do that. With all that said and done, I want to say thank you all for watching and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!